Hi, everyone. Why don't we get started? So can you guys see the photographs? And you can see Warren there and Monish's girls. This is Monsoon, and that's Momachi. You can see the back of Monish's wife's head there, Harina, and you can see Monish just in the corner there, and you can see Laurie there. I don't know what he's looking down at. You can see the Diet Coke. And what you need to know about me is that I was going down with some kind of a cold because I was so nervous before that. There's another view of the same. Now that room, you can actually book that room. It's a semi-open room, and there's the kitchen behind there. There's so many things I was blown away by. But in any case, why am I sharing it with you? Because this guy changed my life, everything about my life, not everything, but many things, because of my opportunity to get to know him and all of those good things. So that's Warren's office there. And it's surprisingly small, apparently. He always keeps the blinds down. There's the famous too hard pile. Actually, when we posed for this photograph, this was empty. And I said, oh, Warren, there's got to be something that's in the too hard pile. And he quickly went and put something in there. So that is a photograph of his dad, I believe. This is in front of the office. And it's just interesting to see that nobody gets to see the wizard, not know how. He has issues with people trying to come talk to him, and he just wants to be left alone. There was a box of See's candies, I believe. A whole bunch of football paraphernalia. He's a fan of the Nebraska, some things. And then Monish and I actually got one of these signs that's above. I don't know whose office that is, but it kind of, that's the entrance over here, and you go through. So what else do we have here? Just some happy memories for me. That's at the Berkshire meeting. That's us meeting with, her name's gone out of my head, but you'll know who it is. And there's me with Monish with my wife, Laurie, Monish wearing the Berkshire shirt. And why am I sharing this with you? I don't know, it's just fun to do it. Debbie Basanet used to have an event where they invited a bunch of Berkshire managers. It was great to be able to go there. Debbie's secret sauce. This is around 2009. I went with Monish. That's visiting the Dakshana dorms somewhere in India. I don't remember where. I met Gillian Segal. I would not have met Gillian at all had it not been for Warren. Her name's gone out of my head, but you know who she is. She's written a book on good investor letters, and her name will come to me in a second. But all these amazing people that I met, some of them, there's Phil Town that some of you know. That I did not meet actually at the Berkshire meeting, but that was a meeting at the Berkshire meeting. There's Ted Wexler at an event hosted by Tracy Britt. So that was Rosie Del Rios. She used to have a signature, the former treasurer of the United States. And this was at the Buffett branch. We got to hang out with Benjamin Schell, who's the CEO of Seritage. And there's Tim Cook. So my goal was to create an Omaha around me, not to move to Omaha. And it's so nice to visit Omaha, but I think that not being able to go this time reminds me, and probably should remind everyone here, that what we need to do is kind of create our own Omaha around us by using the energy that we receive from Berkshire to build our lives around us in the places where we live and in the communities that we're parts of, and those should be spread out around the world. So I'm going to run through before we jump to questions. This crisis has hit my portfolio, but in many ways, I am not in any way. I had some discomfort and so a couple of sleepless nights about 2 weeks ago. I felt a little overexposed in a couple of places, and I sold down by a couple of percentage points. So a bit like Warren selling a bit of his airline stocks, which made me feel quite a bit more comfortable. But otherwise, my mindset is that I'm in the businesses that I'm in. And of course, when you have the kind of thing that's going on in the world, those businesses are going to do less well, and people are going to want to pay less for them. It's a bit like somebody, if you take the analogy to home, somebody dumped a bunch of garbage outside your home. And yeah, nobody wants to live in a home that's got a bunch of garbage outside, but eventually we're going to figure out how to get rid of the garbage. And once we get rid of the hot garbage, my point is that if you really have the mindset of being in the business, I don't have a sense of, I should have sold stocks, I should have lightened up on stocks, there's now time to buy stocks. None of those things. I feel a lot better about it. And it's got something to do with well, obviously having the mindset that I've learned at Berkshire and also having experienced the 2008-9 crisis. So I think that, just a couple of updates for those of you who haven't heard from me before from the book. In the book, I talk about not speaking to management. I think that's a mistake. One should speak to management. One should speak to as many people as possible about the businesses one's invested in. One just needs to do it intelligently and at the right time. Similarly, not in a forum like this, but when I'm with my investors, I certainly want to talk about the companies that we own. But I do talk about the companies that we own, and I engage with the management in all sorts of ways. So that was point 2 on my list of things here. I'll get through this quite quickly. A couple of things that I've just come up with during this coronavirus crisis that I've come to understand and learn, if you like. First of all, I do think that optimism wins. It's not easy to be an optimist when we see the world falling apart so suddenly and so thoroughly and in a way that nobody seems to be able to control. And during those periods, it certainly doesn't pay to be an optimist. But as a life strategy, there's so much evidence to show that being optimistic is the way to be, not because necessarily that predicts what's happening next, but because optimistic people tend to succeed more. And I saw an interview with Warren. Warren, he said America's progress might get interrupted, but it's not going to be stopped. And the world's progress might be interrupted, but it's not going to be stopped. So this is a significant interruption, but it's not the end of it. Something else that I feel like has really driven into me is I spent the early years of my investing career studying inside out business models that have been falling apart for the last 10 years, or maybe not falling apart, but the moats have been getting narrower. And, one set of businesses that have not been damaged very much by recent events is all these cloud-based businesses. And it reiterates for me, in a way, Warren doesn't mind that he missed Google and Amazon. Well, I mind a lot, and I'm determined not to miss any more. And it's funny because I started using, I think that I'm a relatively early adopter of all sorts of things. If I would have invested, paid a little more attention to some of the products that I've been using, and it doesn't just extend to Amazon and Google, but companies like Dropbox and Apple and Salesforce, and I need to pay far closer attention to those companies. And I've kind of slavishly followed the Norman Rockwell style of investing, and I'm determined not to do that. The cloud demonstrates that to me. So just a little bit about crises in general. Many times I felt like I was going to throw up during the financial crisis. It was just not a pleasant experience for me, but that's not the most scared I've ever been. The most scared I've ever been was visiting the Weizmann Institute in Tel Aviv. We were staying in Tel Aviv. We had various events planned in Rehovot, south of Tel Aviv, and I have no idea why, but the pleasant people who run the Gaza Strip decided it was time to fire missiles at Tel Aviv. And it was the first time that I felt like I was the target of live fire. And it was a feeling of terror because I knew that the people firing those missiles would be quite happy if it hit me. And I saw how the fear spread in the hotel that we were staying in. And we were away from our children. It was deeply, deeply unpleasant. And actually, funnily enough, for my father, who understands these things really well because he's been in multiple military conflicts in Israel, he said to me something that stuck with me. He said, yeah, and the really difficult thing is that you don't know when it's going to stop. So when the crisis is happening, when you're under fire in that case, or when the financial crisis is happening, you have an enormous amount of certainty. Is this going to come to an end in 5 minutes, in 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years, 50 years? There's a period in history called the 100 Years' War. And so that uncertainty about what's going to happen to me and how long is it going to last is very, very high. But what I've learned is that in those moments, the world feels upside down. Nothing feels right. And decisions taken in those moments, for the vast majority of cases, are probably wrong. And so, for example, during the missiles falling on Tel Aviv, we were being told to go to the shelters. But experienced Israelis, when I walked out into the street during the crisis, during missiles being fired, there were some people walking their dogs. Some people have learned that it's better not to follow the herd into the basement, and actually the probability of a missile hitting exactly where you are is extraordinarily small. So there's a very high likelihood that for all of our portfolios, where we are is absolutely fine, and that all the businesses will get through this crisis absolutely fine. There's going to be some significant quotational losses, but most decisions taken at a time of the world being upside down are probably not good decisions. And the uncertainty of not knowing when it's going to come to an end is extremely unpleasant, but this will come to an end. And then it will feel like a very short period of time. It will feel like nothing, even though it feels like an endless eternity when one is going through it. So a couple of other things, and then I'm going to jump to questions. I've been doing this course on the science of well-being, positive psychology, and I just want to make these habits that I do every day, and I'll share with you a couple of things that I'm extraordinarily grateful for. One is that after the last financial crisis, I converted the vast majority of my shareholder base to a zero management fee structure where you keep your money for at least a year at a time. And so I think that many investors in my shoes, if they have outside money, are worried about big redemption requests. And I'm actually not worried about that at all. And that helps me to feel far, far more comfortable. The other thing that I'm extraordinarily grateful for is I feel really lucky to be able to talk to my father on a regular basis. Nothing seems to faze him. And I always feel he's got a calm and collected view of the world. Something about having survived multiple shooting wars makes him look at this and he doesn't think much of it. So, but I think it's all good. I did that partly because I think we should all be doing that. I loved the Charlie Munger interview. I think it was with Jason Zweig, where he said, he didn't see this coming. Nobody he knows, none of the public commentators saw it coming. But now all of the public commentators who didn't see this coming are going to tell us what's going to happen next. If they're so smart about how the world's going to develop, why didn't they tell us that this was coming? And I think there's a lot of commentary that's out there about how the world is going to change in this or that very profound way, and travel's going to change, and cruise ships are going to change, and public transportation is going to change. And we can argue about how much it isn't going to change. But the thing that we need to focus on at all times is those things that a human needs that never change. I was fascinated to discover that, sales of Hermes products in China once stores were reopened are very, very, very strong. And I think that in a world where we don't know whether the beautiful career that Warren Buffett had picking stocks, we don't know if we can achieve the same results, even if we had the same intelligence and ability. We need to focus on the things that aren't changing in humans. And if we can solve those needs in humans around us, then we're going to live successful lives. And in my case, I just now have this mantra. I try to serve, it's about three groups. It's my investors, try to serve them. I try to serve the CEOs of the companies that I'm invested in. I try to serve our partners and suppliers. And then kind of like a sort of slightly broader group. And why am I doing this call? Because that is a broader group of people from whom kind of the petri dish in which all of that lives. But I'm really, if I can serve those groups well, then I should be successful. And I urge everybody on this call to think about their lives the same way. So there's an email that probably many of you got. If you didn't, you can sign up for it from my personal website, guysphere.com. So I'm going to just go to the questions pretty much in the order that they were received. And I printed them out here, as you can see. So Stefan Bogdan writes that my friend Phil Town mentioned a handful of companies considered strong enough to survive in this crazy market. He wanted to ask me the same question. What would be my list of 10 good companies that, in my opinion, are good enough to survive? This is not being asked as advice, but more from an educational point of view for Stefan Bogdan to research and understand what is my view of a good company. And, I promise you, Stefan, that 20 years ago, we all thought that the Washington Post was a fantastic company. And 10 years ago, if you would have said that the Unilevers of the world, to me, that the Unilevers of the world are going to have their moats narrowed by the advent of businesses based on the kind of business like Dollar Shave Club, I would have said, nah, not going to happen. And the fact of the matter, it does, and it did. So, my evaluation of a moat and whether it's expanding is just my evaluation. There's no eternal definition of a good business. The nature of the environment is that it's constantly changing, and we need to keep up with and abreast of that. There's a time when Warren Buffett thought that buying shoe companies in the United States was the right thing to do. It wasn't, and I don't know where those shoe companies are in Berkshire. At around the same time, he bought See's Candies. See's Candies moat is, I believe, every bit as strong now as it was then. So, my opinions on this stuff are not the ones that count. There are all sorts of businesses that pretty much look like infrastructure. And once you've got the infrastructure in place, it's very hard and very unlikely that you're going to want to move it around. And one business, and unfortunately, most of those businesses are very highly valued. So people understand that. But a business that I'm not in, but I'd love to be in, if you like, through investing, is the business of providing industrial gases. So that's kind of a natural monopoly because you have all these plants and pipelines that interconnect. And once you have the assets in place, nobody else has really any interest in competing with those assets. So that would be an example of a great business. There's a company down the road here called Schindler Elevator, and there's a company called Otis that was just spun out of Pratt & Whitney or United Technologies. I think that those are great businesses, but the service contracts on the elevators are fantastic. Your installation of the elevator is a loss leader, but the key is to buy them at really, really good prices. So there are a couple. As Warren said in an interview just recently, these cloud computing companies are fantastic businesses, and they're very, very highly valued as a result. So, they are good businesses. Will they be good businesses in the future? I can't tell you. The environment's changing. Are their moats getting wider or narrower right now? I don't know. I suspect they're getting wider. At some point, they may get narrowed for all sorts of reasons. They may get narrowed because the woman who regulates these businesses in the EU, Margaret Verstager, finds a way to hit them. Microsoft was an extraordinarily dominant company. They had serious pins stuck in their wheels by the European Commission. So thank you, Stefan. I hope that's helpful. Jernej, advice for a young beginning investor, Smet. Go for it. Don't risk a lot for a little. Be intelligent. Read as much as you can. And get out there and do it. Kailas writes to me and asks, with the COVID situation, there is a widespread impact all over the world and businesses will be impacted. Well, the top few businesses that I see being impacted, hotels, airlines, tourism, anything related to luxury spending that might be impacted for a long time. As a long-term investor, we might see some good businesses at attractive valuations during the crisis. What sectors do I feel are most attractive going forward? And you kind of pretty much named it there. My father's view is that in 2 years' time, nobody's going to remember any of this. And I just remind you, 9/11, can you imagine some people walked onto planes, used pocket knives to hold the pilots hostage and then flew the planes into buildings. And there was no security at airports. And people like me and many others thought there's nobody ever going to fly again. Fact of the matter is people did. We found a way. I believe that things will go to many things will go back to the way they were. I don't think people are going to stop traveling. I don't think people are going to stop wanting for both holidays and for business. And, again, so just remember that decision-making in the crisis is probably, and saying the world has now changed completely because of the crisis, I'm not sure is the right way to be. The right way to be is to say what's not changed. What is still true? What will always be true? To take the See's Candy example, people like chocolate. And so, investing in a chocolate business is probably a good thing to do. pre, post, during. And by the way, that idea of focusing on things that are not changing is from Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos, the guy who came up with that. So how will the COVID crisis impact the overall world economy? There's just one thing that I want to share with the group here. It is really, really important to remember. So in a certain way, newspapers and news organizations are kind of having a field day because they're getting lots of excuses for screaming headlines that get our attention. Somebody will say that, well, look at the price of oil. I mean, we all saw that. And it was kind of like really scary in a certain way, negative price of oil. And we have this ability to project in a linear way anything that we see. So, we had trouble seeing the rate at which cases of COVID-19 would increase because they're increasing exponentially and we see things linearly. But now that they're beyond the peak, we keep imagining it's going to continue at the peak, and it takes time for us to adjust. It takes time for it. It's hard for us to believe that the oil price will recover from minus 45, but it will. We see these enormous job loss numbers, but what we're not seeing and is not obvious are the extraordinary government responses. And it feels weird. It feels weird to see the government spending such enormous amounts of money, but they're doing the right thing. What they're doing is they're stepping in where liquidity is drying up and where demand is drying up as much as they possibly can. They're stepping in and being the lender of last resort and the buyer of last resort. Policymakers have learned we're not going to go through, or my prediction is, I believe this very strongly, we're not going to go through a 1930s depression. The policymakers have learned there were enormous mistakes were made at that time, and they're not going to make the same mistakes again, and they understand that. And there are going to be some people who are going to say that they're trashing the public finances, or they're trashing the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, but believe me and trust me, they're doing the right thing, and they will mitigate a lot of this stuff, and there'll be green shoots before we know it. So I expect a V-shaped recovery. I think that is extremely unlikely at this point, but it will be a U-shaped recovery, and I don't believe it lasts 2 years. And I think that what's important is if we know that we can get to a vaccine, we know eventually we'll get to herd immunity. There are so many different reasons why we know this is coming to an end, tops 2 years, but possibly in the next 2 or 3 months. So more reasons to be optimistic. So how will Berkshire deploy their cash? I'm looking forward to the meeting, looking forward to finding out. They can always repurchase their shares. And I think that in the time when Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger are not around, they'll become very large purchasers of their own shares. And maybe the instructions that Warren gives his lieutenants is that they should just deploy capital, for example, in the businesses where they know, or Warren knows they can deploy it well, for example, the railways and in energy. And otherwise, please just keep repurchasing shares until the company's one great big railway and energy company. I'm not sure. I'd love to, that's part of why we go to the meeting. Last question that came through me into my email inbox. We met, this is Jernej, and we met at a barbecue party in the DACH region. Mittelstand companies, the most important part of the economy, and they account for the majority of jobs, substantially to the GDP. Some of those companies belong to the elite group called Hidden Champions. As such, they enjoy strong positions in their respective niche markets. Pricing power, they have pricing power and have moats that might not be obvious to everyone. Furthermore, the Germanic management style is straightforward and with high ethical standards. Seems to me this is the perfect hunting ground for a long-term Berkshire-like investment company. Hardly such companies exist, and none of Berkshire's size or track record. Why is this the case, in my opinion? Thinking big, can this be an opportunity? I would tell you that the German market is, I think, a market that Berkshire would love to crack. The Mittelstand is an amazing, it's kind of like the pride of Germany in many ways. It's not clear to me why Berkshire hasn't cracked that market, and it's not clear to me why it hasn't been cracked in Germany. And is it an area of opportunity? Absolutely. There's a forum in Frankfurt called the Eigenkapital Forum, and I've never been, but I think that some of that stuff happens there. And I think my simplistic evaluation is, yes, it's an opportunity for somebody who lives in Germany, speaks German mother tongue, but I really don't know is the answer. So Yedu asks, how have my personal life and investments changed in the last 6 weeks? Curious to know what I've been up to in the last couple of months. So, my fund is down approximately 20%. Like I said, it's not surprising given that we're invested in businesses and businesses have been brought practically to a standstill. I've been, because in situation of uncertainty, perhaps everybody does it, I've been making sure that I'm not making unusual expenditures. I'm not committing to any large expenditures in my personal life or in my business life. And I'm kind of pleased with the amount of time that I have because I'm not traveling as much. And a significant portion of my own personal expenses have been travel. So that's not terrible. I mean, in a certain way, I'm not impacted in the way I'm impacted. My mood is impacted because sitting at home hasn't been great. I'm sure that's been the same for everyone. But what I'm doing is I'm finding opportunities to invest. I just started. I've really enjoyed doing the 3 or 4 conversations, I call them, that I've had with various people that I've put online for people to listen to. And I start off with those conversations private, so only a small group, and then to the extent that the subjects of the conversation don't mind, I make it public, and even now on Spotify, but I haven't figured out how to get it onto Apple iTunes. But I think that to continue to invest in oneself, in one's relationships, is always going to be a smart thing to do, and that's what I guess I've enjoyed doing the most. And now we have Sudhanshu, Jace. Jace, everyone, is a big swimmer. We haven't met personally, but we're connected on Strava. So 137 billion, the increase of 10 billion. Do I think that he's watching the Mac review or saw issues of losses in his holdings? He wanted to cut his losses. Sorry, Jace. I think that it's not clear to me what he did with the airline stocks. I think some part of him regrets owning the airline stocks, but he just wanted to sell them down a little bit. I've actually learned that selling down a position by a little bit makes me feel, there were 2 positions that I sold down just a little bit, and it made me feel a lot better about my portfolio, made me happy to know that I'd taken some money out. There are a couple of positions where I bought and I was happy to have done that, but this kind of very small moves around the edges. When you look at the size of this portfolio, an increase in 10 billion is it's not significant from Berkshire's standpoint. So I don't think he wanted to cut his losses. Although I still think, he made a commitment to the airline business. I think that, going back, he would, I don't know, I can't judge. So am I paying attention to the market as a whole? Am I watching a small selection of companies I wish to own? I know a guy who left all WhatsApp groups and switched off his Bloomberg monitor for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I feel quite confident that he's going to end up doing really well. It's really hard to be looking at the market because the market, more than any other time, is just screaming all sorts of things at you the whole time. And, I did a review of my portfolio. I made some adjustments. Even the companies that are significantly hit, I believe that all of them will make it through this crisis just fine. And some of the ones that are cyclical are going to have some extraordinary rebounds when those rebounds happen. I'm doing research, in-depth research on a couple of companies that I would have been doing in-depth research on before the crisis. And unfortunately, they haven't gone particularly cheaper because of the crisis. So remember that this concept that where the market says, swing you bastard or swing you idiot, is even more sort of loud in these environments. And doing nothing is just fine. It's just fine. We may turn out that Warren, other than selling down minor adjustments of positions, has not done a lot. So I hope that's helpful, Jace. Yedu, it's really important. So here's probably not the best analogy, but it's the analogy that I use with my dad. So imagine that the economic system is a house, and we've got a water tank, a big water tank at the top. And just imagine in this kind of special house, all the taps are open, baths and showers are open, and there's kind of water flowing constantly. That's kind of like, imagine that's the flow of liquidity, financial liquidity through the economy. And then somehow there's some system where when the water comes through at the bottom, it gets recycled up to the top. So you have to kind of concept of circular flow of money. And now, because of Corona and because of the lockdown, somebody's gone around and shut a bunch of taps off. Not all of them, but many of the taps are shut off. And the basins that they were filling are now emptying out. But when those basins empty out, that's not a good thing. And so the Federal Reserve is running around with buckets of water, filling basins left, right, and center. And somebody comes and says, well, with the Federal Reserve coming and filling all these basins with water, are you not worried that the house is going to get flooded? And the answer is no, all these taps are turned off. So it's kind of scary to see the federal balance sheet increase in such a crazy way. And it's kind of scary to see the Fed buying assets that they never would have bought before. But if you take the analogy and say, my God, I never thought I'd see the Fed running with buckets of water and filling that bath in XYZ person's bedroom. Yeah, but the bath is empty, and that's what they're doing right now. And when the economy restarts, I think it will be I actually used to think that it was going to be very inflationary. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that the Fed will be just fine to remove that liquidity. They're able to remove that. They will be able to remove that liquidity in all sorts of ways. So no, I'm not worried about it. David, investing tips for young investors. Get started. Be prepared to make mistakes. Don't mistakes with your life savings. Manage your investments such that when you make a big mistake, and there'll be plenty of big mistakes, that's just that's going to be something you can survive and thrive with. And get that process of making mistakes under your belt early, making mistakes and moving on after you've made them. So, make sure you don't take too big ballsy bets, because the mistakes may stop you in your tracks. And just a quick thought for you on that front. Managing one's energies, I've seen a few people who've left the investment business, not because they weren't good, not because they didn't have good track records, they did, but I think that the stress got to them. And so I think it's really important to manage if you plan on being successful at compounding. So that's part of why shorting is not a great idea. It's, in addition to the mathematics and all sorts of other things, people who short live very stressful lives. And that is going to reduce your ability to continue to do it for a very long time. So you just say to yourself, I'm never going to short. There's a whole bunch of stresses that have left your system. When I said to myself, I'm not going to take investors who don't invest with me for any less than 1 year at a time, that took a bunch of stresses away from me. So if you plan on being successful, then get the habits and get the ways of doing things that are going to enable you to do it for an extraordinarily long period of time. So Sanjeev, do I agree with Warren that the extraordinary thing about some large tech companies is that they do not need any capital, but on the contrary, throw off a lot of capital, therefore they're great long-term investments? Sanjeev, it depends on the price. And what price is a good price to pay? And you're not paying a low price for them, although they are great businesses. And that's been my trouble in buying them all along. And so that is a difficult question. I think that if it was an easy cinch for Warren to figure out, he would have done it already. And then there's the famous talk that my friend Monish had at one of the business schools, where he compares his investment in one company with my investment in MasterCard. MasterCard trades at a much, much higher valuation, which is going to do better. I mean, and by and large, I think the market's extraordinarily efficient. Sanjeev, you understand it, and I understand it, and a bunch of other people do. And so those businesses are pretty fairly priced, it seems to me. Am I surprised that Warren didn't buy shares? First of all, I haven't had the chance, believe it or not, to look at their earnings release. So it would have been nice to see, because with 137 billion, you would imagine that he would still have left over for doing one or two other things. He might get the question tomorrow. Terry, what's Norman Rockwell? So look up Norman Rockwell paintings, and they're beautiful, but they kind of have this kind of Midwest 1930s family having dinner together. Not your kind of Silicon Valley futuristic type of, sort of like kind of boring people in a certain way. And if you look at the managers of Berkshire businesses, they're not young, fiery souls. So that was what I meant by the Norman Rockwell style of investing. What's the best place for people to migrate out of the US due to recent immigration policies? Yeah, Siva, the answer is Canada. Canada's an amazing place, just an amazing place. If you can't get into the United States, Canada's extraordinary. So is Australia. The United Kingdom's not so terrible. Europe's a little more difficult if you don't speak one of the languages. But Canada's extraordinary. My daughter, when we visited Vancouver, she said she wanted to study there. I have read some, if not all, of Ray Dalio's stuff, writings on various things. I think that sort of focus on reality. I think that often immigrants who have had to work their way into an economy are much more realistic about who they are and what their prospects are and what's going to unfold than others. And so I think that that's something that I've learned from Ray Dalio and his debt cycles, and understand, I don't think I understood that. And I studied economics, and boy, I would have liked to have known about that. I have not read more specifically on how he believes the world is changing, so I may not be able to comment on that. Yeah, rising hostilities to China. Actually, one of the investments I sold was in China. I felt better about that. I'm super angry at China because it's becoming clear that they haven't been the most honest actors in this crisis, and not sharing information openly and in fact suppressing it is part of what caused it. At the same time, the world has to get along. And so, I know that's what Charlie Munger's going to say. So I don't think that I have any real exposure to what might unfold with China, but I think it's probably good for manufacturing in other parts of the world. And at the end of the day, I think that countries need to unite and get a policy together that exerts sufficient pressure on China to become a better team player in the world, because it seems like, it just appears from what I'm reading, that some of their actions were not very team-spirited, if you like. Moving on to Peter Way. Thank you for sharing your insights and experience. Very appreciated. How do I buy into a position? Do I buy all at once as soon as the company gets on sale, or do I slowly buy tranches over a longer period of time? This feels especially hard during market disruptions. If I have multiple companies on my watch list and only some are getting on sale, thank you. I think that buying a position is a bit like getting married, and usually it's a very, very happy thing to be buying something that we understand, and it's a bit like the relationship's just getting going. I think that for me, I know people who just make one huge set of purchases once they've figured out that they want to own it, and that's not been the case for me. I would tell you, the real issue is not in the buying, it's in the selling. Buying is actually relatively easy. It's selling that's really, really hard. I think that I reevaluate and I see it and I say, wow, I really want it to be a higher proportion of my portfolio, and that comes in combination with doing more work and research and conversations. And so what I need to be doing is constantly looking at the portfolio and saying, am I over or underweighted in this? And with an awareness that, 2% positions, 5% positions, maybe there's some positions that 10%, some positions that balloon because the company does well, to a much higher proportion of the portfolio. I think that another thing that I've learned in this crisis is that, I went into it with less cash than I would have liked. Maybe everybody who went into it, no matter what their cash levels were less than what they would have liked. But there's a level of cash that makes you feel strong. And you always want to have that feeling of strength. And I think that that's probably around, for me, it's 15 to 20% of my portfolio, which is above where it is right now, and I'm not planning to get there anytime soon. But the pressure, when times are normal, when times are good, if I'm not raising cash in some way or other by selling down something that I still love, but I want to get to that strong position of having 20% cash. I think that's something that I've learned and that I plan to implement in various different ways. And in terms of buying, I would just say that it's in my case, it's kind of haphazard. And another very important point is that you need to be careful about chasing positions down. Sometimes you get it wrong, and you can get into a loop where the more it goes down, the more you buy, the more it goes down. You kind of like, I guess the expression is throwing good money after bad. So try to establish the position as a percentage of the overall portfolio at around the time that I've bought it, but then leave it alone, even though it may decline significantly in the meantime. And I can think of 3 cases where the price of what I owned went down by way more than 50% before it went to a 10x of the price that I bought it. But in many cases, or in some cases, that's not the case. It goes down and then it goes to 0. In one case, that happened to me. And so to have chased it all the way down would not have been a good thing. Peter, it's not easy. And as Charlie Munger famously said, if it was easy, then everybody would be doing it. It's not supposed to be easy. So Tobias manages a small partnership, shamelessly cloning the fee structure of Buffett, Monish, and myself, non-cumulative without a lockup. Should I use pre-tax or after-tax performance for the calculation of the fee? So what I'd say, Tobias, is don't ask the lawyers. The lawyers are not going to come up with good answers for you. I think that Monish has the best answer, which is just to slavishly copy what has worked for other people. I think that is probably, I think that the way Warren does it is pre-tax. I would tell you that what strikes me, what jumps out at me from that is the lockup, because it's exactly when markets are disrupted that your most fearful investor is going to want to take his money out. That's exactly the time when you're going to have great opportunities to buy. So in exactly those moments, you've got 2 different uses for the money. And one is somebody personally wanting to use the money, and the other is for the benefit of all of your investors in the portfolio. So if you don't have that lockup, you're going to, it's kind of guaranteed there's going to be one person. I mean, I have 150 investors. There's going to be one person who's going to be super fearful, and they cannot mess it up for everybody else. So I would, if I was an investor in your structure, that would be a big flag to me. I'd be very, very concerned about that. And I would also urge you to consider to do a cumulative hurdle. So would Netflix be a good purchase for Apple? George, would I think it probably would, but I don't think the competition authorities would allow it. That would create an extraordinary concentration of power. But I really don't understand either of the 2 businesses well enough. Eivind, Costco is a source of great pain to me because I've understood what Costco is for a long time, and I should have owned it a long time ago and didn't. And it's a great business, and it's not particularly cheap. I think that, what is a good price level for the stock? I don't know. Probably less than where it is right now. But I've been wrong on that. I've been wrong on Amazon. I've been wrong on plenty of things. And you're asking the right question. So Jonathan asks, what do I think about people who are doom and gloom and all the people who want to wait for things to settle before investing? And I don't have the data for you right here in front of you, but I don't think it's hard to find. I don't know how many people, mainly Democrats in New York City, who, when they saw that Donald Trump had been elected, sold all their shares. But Warren didn't sell all of his shares, and he's a Democrat. So pay attention to what Warren did. The idea that we can foretell when it's, quote, safe to get back in is a very human idea. It's an idea that has been wired into us. When we see somebody go and eat the red berries and they fall dead, and we go, maybe I won't eat the red berries until I see somebody else eating the red berries and surviving. But that's not the way the markets work. The way the markets work is that they've done a statistic that shows that something like 90% of all the returns in the market come on 10% of the days. It's some crazy ratio like that. the idea that you can predict when it's safe to get in and capture the returns before you got in, I think is extraordinarily hard. I think that, on the flip side, the trade that Bill Ackman did, he bet a small amount and won big. But believe me, what we don't read about is the number of times he bet a small enough and did not win, the number of times he bet a big amount and did not win, except for Valiant. And we've read about that. But it's very, very hard to do. And it kind of sounds trite to say it, but I don't see in the Forbes 500 list of richest people in the world, United States, wherever, he made it because he timed his entrances and his exits from the market. You see the Walton family who just hung out in Walmart for 50 years. You see the Kroc family who hung out in McDonald's for God knows how long. That's where the wealth was made. And I think that speaks volumes. And so, but Jonathan, the thing to do is not to argue with them, because you're never going to convince them of that. And realize that so when a crisis like this happens, we get, there's a part of our brain, the sort of reptilian brain, that takes over in many, many people. And so there's fight, flight, and freeze. So to the extent that I get taken over, my strongest reaction is freeze. And freeze is probably it's the least bad of the three. The ideal is to stay in your rational brain. That's where I think Warren manages to stay. If you're going to go into the reptilian brain, freeze, provided you made reasonable choices in your portfolio. You're not leveraged, you're not short, you're not invested in some speculative something, you're invested in real businesses. Freeze is just fine. But if somebody's in fight or flight, it's going to be very hard to convince them of anything. So I would just tell you, the person who's saying wait for things to settle is saying I'm so scared. My amygdala, my reptilian brain have taken over, and you just have to leave them alone and let them be, but don't let them influence you. By the way, Jonathan, as part of creating a better environment for ourselves, it doesn't mean that we shut them out of our lives, but we just place them. Okay, that's a reptilian brain that's extraordinarily fearful right now. Hope that's helpful. Erin, you're reading my book. Thank you for reading it. As a recovering, overachieving academic yourself. I can't say I was an overachiever. I was attempting to overachieve. Erin, I just need to remember that I'm trying to keep myself from researching the depression like a historian instead of actually investing. Any advice to keep me on the path? Yeah. Well, that's where I think that optimism probably is helpful. And so you might want to study Buffett's optimism. I don't think any amount of analysis, drawing parallels between now and the Great Depression, I mean, if you had the time to do a PhD on the topic, you might come to some conclusions. We all know the famous statement by, I don't know who it is, but he was asked about the French Revolution. It was like sort of 200 years after it happened. And his response was, it's too early to tell. I think that, there's plenty of evidence, Aaron, that people who are optimistic end up succeeding more than people who are not optimistic. And so I think that, to just trash the history and just be optimistic, this is going to come to an end. And when it does, the world will move on. And if we're in businesses that deliver things to people that they will want before, during, and after the crisis, like food or all the things that we know, then we should do fine. We should do okay. I don't know if that's helpful. But I think that, I'm not very practical, and I'm not very good at organizing things, so in a certain way, one of the reasons why this is a business suits me is that I'm so useless at getting anything done most of the time, and most of the time what you want to do is do nothing. So that sort of fits, if you like. But maybe something that will be helpful to you is you don't want to get into analysis paralysis. And how does one not get into analysis paralysis? I think the answer is, Aaron, or maybe part of the answer is, first of all, you have self-awareness. Try and increase that self-awareness. And then, try and work on your environment in terms of who you talk to, and figure out the person who, uncovers in you the willingness to act just enough, and try and sort of move away or spend a little less time with the people who kind of rev up your capacity for analysis paralysis, maybe. But I think that part of the journey is to become aware of who you are, and you seem to be, not surprisingly, well on that road. Clinton writes, "Hi Guy, what do I think will happen to industries such as airlines, cruises, restaurants, commercial real estate? Could it be that most airlines will go bankrupt? We would end up, let's say, 2 or 3 airlines in the future. I'm just thinking there's a real possibility of shrinkage in certain industries such as airlines, retailers, etc." So, Clinton, remember, we're in the middle of the crisis. It's really, really hard to judge what will happen. And I, on another call, showed some charts, which I'm not going to try and pull up now, that show the, what airline travel has done, what passenger cruise ships have done. And, I know this is a big event, but I actually think one way or another, humans, the desire to go on cruises by a certain section of the population, the desire to travel is not going away, hasn't gone away. And, there is no moral hazard here. So there is no reason why the government should not step in and say, okay, this is going to be a tough period. We don't want you to go bankrupt and lose and have people lose employment because of this crisis. So we're going to sustain you. We're going to give you interest-free loans. I mean, the government's practically borrowing interest-free until we can figure out a way out of this. And let's just remember that if we get a vaccine tomorrow, then we're out of it tomorrow. I realize that may take forever. But even if it takes forever, there'll be other things that happen. Similarly, I think that people have a strong desire to eat out, and people have a strong desire to go to offices, I believe, strong desire to go to shopping malls, desire to meet in a third space, whether it's a Starbucks or a McDonald's I think that is all on its way back. And so I don't think those businesses change so much. I think that some of the wise things that I've read say that what this probably does is accelerates the changes that were already happening. So, it accelerates the use of the cloud, for example. So it'll accelerate those changes, but I don't think it's going to fundamentally flip. Businesses are there to meet maybe not basic human needs, but to meet needs that are innately human, I guess. Julio asks, my question is regarding the list of investors that I would have invest my money on my behalf if I wasn't a professional money manager, e.g. Mayar Capital, run by my friend Abdulaziz Al-Naim. Could I share what attributes exactly I see in these managers and their organizations that make them stand out in my eyes? Would it be linked to simply copying the Berkshire investment philosophy? Is there more nuance to this? For someone still early in an investing career, would I have him look at the same attributes in his employer, or do I think that there are different skills or lessons that should be sought after at that point in time? Julio, you're asking some phenomenal questions, and the phenomenal questions in a certain way are unanswerable because they get to the core of the matter. And first of all, I wrote a piece of white paper, I called it, titled "With Whom I Would Invest." And I kind of listed 5 criteria that I would use to pick somebody to manage my investments for me if I was not managing them myself. And the criteria included things like having the fiduciary gene, the idea that they treated it as a real partnership, meaning that they weren't doing it as a business to earn fees off me. There are a few other attributes that I should be able to recall, but I can't right now. In any case, anybody who wants to get that document, you're welcome to it. Go to my website and send me a message or tweet me or something, and I'll make sure that you get a link that you can download it. And that it's a pretty big list of people, and there are some of them are people that I know, some of them are people that I don't know, that I've heard about, or they've sent me their letters into my email inbox. And it's not the final list. I mean, what I suggest in that letter is that I'd probably have like 4 or 5 people max, and it would include 1 or 2 companies like Berkshire Hathaway or Exor, and it would include 1 or 2 funds, like perhaps, as you mentioned, Abdulaziz's Meyer Capital, or Howard Lichtstrahl, who's on this call, and a couple of other great investors who are on this call. Actually, I feel slightly self-conscious having, if you're there. Looking for the same attributes in your employer. I mean, actually a classmate of mine, Mark Pincus, who founded Zynga Games, went to work for TCI in Denver for John Malone, effectively. I mean, I don't know how big that group was, but I think he had pretty close contact with John Malone. I think that was a way smarter move than my move, and he went out there because he admired John Malone. Now, I'm not the same personality as Mark Pincus, but that was a great move. And Richard Rainwater has a story like that, where he went to work for, I don't remember, maybe it was the Hunt brothers, and initially lost them a lot of money. And they said they just paid for the most expensive education ever, and that they were certainly not firing him or any of those things. But I think that was transformative for him. I think that you probably need to relax the criteria a little bit if you're looking for that in an employer. And in many ways, and I get this to some degree, is that I'm just not set up to take employees and to take, apprentices in a certain way to what I'm doing. And so you may just find the person you want to become doesn't want to hire somebody like you, so you have to broaden your criteria a little bit. But to get into the company of somebody whose business career you admire, even if they don't 100% have the qualities that you would want to have as an investor yourself, I think is a good thing. It's getting around the right people, I write in my book, is perhaps the most important thing. But it's, as Charlie Munger said, it's not getting the perfect wife, it's getting the best wife you can get who will have you. So there's a whole other side to it, that they need to want to have you. And I could have tried to go work for Warren Buffett. I don't think he would have given me the time of day for all sorts of reasons. And so we have to find the path. But I went in a certain way, scraped the bottom of the barrel, and I could have gotten way better than that and didn't, because I had these ideas about me being a hero and me getting there all on my own. And getting around the right people is really important. And that skill of adjusting one's criteria to fit one's own marketability, the opportunity set that is out there, is kind of like what it's all about in a certain way. But it's a great question. It's not easy to answer. Writes to me and says, do I anticipate less than favorable quarterly earnings statements coming from companies? Do I anticipate the market to react accordingly, or have we potentially seen the last of the behavioral swings? Troy. So let's realize this, or remember this, Troy. Management accounts produced by managers, and there was a guy, John Galbraith, who wrote about something called the bezel. I'm not going to get into a long discussion of the bezel, but one can. I guess the bezel is those things, little bits of bad news that you wish you didn't have to tell somebody, and you'd really rather put under the rug. And maybe every now and then, or a lot of the time, you get away with putting it under the rug. But now we have coronavirus, and it's an excuse for a lot of people to take a big bath. So all those things that people were hiding under the rug, all those losses in subsidiaries that they really didn't want to recognize and acknowledge, now's the time to take them. So I think that earnings seasons will be ghastly for all sorts of reasons. And yeah, we're going to get big swings. I think that's just the nature of it. But I think that at the same time, what we're going to have is the government, the Federal Reserve, making vast amounts of money available. So it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to get extraordinarily cheap. And possibly part of Berkshire's difficulty is, if the government is offering money for free, why should they take Berkshire's money? Why should a company in need of capital take Berkshire's money? So I do think earnings will be horrible for all sorts of reasons, probably worse than they actually needed to be, but it's the opportunity to take the big bath. Balakrishna Joshi writes, Mr. Pramotsa's Fairfax has BlackBerry as one of the top holdings. BlackBerry now seems to have fully transitioned into high-margin, pure software company with 1.1 billion in revenue, around 80% gross margin in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, autonomous driving, and the like. I have not studied BlackBerry, and every time I used to have a BlackBerry, every time, look, I'm writing down a note that I should take a look at it. So I have nothing intelligent to say about it, but I'm curious to see, and so I'm going to enjoy looking at that. So Thomas asks, why is Warren holding back investing his capital in the current environment? I mean, I think that the best explanation that I have is that the market's still pretty efficient. Things that are highly priced companies are highly priced for a reason, and things that have dropped for a reason. And so he's just not seeing the opportunities that he'd like to see. You know, I bet we can ask him. We'll find out. And it's worth saying that a lot of the companies that have dropped, that have not risen, are these small cap companies that are way too small for him to put serious amounts of money to work in them. Having said that, you know, I heard a rumor that he was going to try and buy Boeing. I don't know what happened to that. Maybe it was just a rumor, and perhaps I shouldn't have said that because that kind of perpetuates a rumor. I have no basis in fact for that. He already owns an oil company that has paid him in shares, so he's getting more ownership of Occidental Petroleum. Maybe he sees that's fine. You could probably buy a big chunk of another oil company. Maybe, you know, he just doesn't want to. It's a great question. All I can do is speculate. I don't really know. George, what are the primary indicators of long-term success in a company? I think that the one little, you know, if I knew the answer to that, maybe, you know, I'd have more people to help us do a high quality video. But so I'm just a student with you. I'm trying to learn as you are. And, you know, so somebody wrote, seek not the masters, not that I'm a master, seek what they sought. So don't run after Charlie and Warren, run after what Charlie and Warren are running after, if you like. And one thing that I've learned is, you know, personality doesn't matter. And the personality of the person at the top or of the group at the top really does make a difference. And, you know, I never actually got to meet, there was a time in New York when one of a group of friends put together a meeting with the CFO of Costco and Jim Sinegal. And the people who'd been to that meeting said that he was just extraordinary. They came away extraordinarily impressed with some of the qualities that he exhibited. And I think that that counts for a lot more than I've given credit to. But you still need good economics. You can have some very, very well-meaning managers, but if they don't have good economics, it's not going to work. You know, there's the CEO of Rolls-Royce right now had an extraordinary career at a fabulous semiconductor company whose name escapes me. And a lot of, you know, I think that he's having great difficulties with Rolls-Royce's business, just a difficult business. The business he'd been in was difficult as well, but there's no guarantee that if you got it right once, he needed extraordinary abilities to make a success of the semiconductor company that he was a part of. I don't remember their name. But even that and extraordinary ability is no guarantee that you're going to be able to pull a second one, even though any board of directors would have wanted him and would have heaved a huge sigh of relief. So the manager's not enough, but the manager's certainly a part of it. I think, George, maybe another thing that's worth saying is that, you know, the Santa Fe Institute, I regret not spending more time around them. And if we kind of see these evolving ecosystems, I write about it in my book, The Journey to the Ants by E.O. Wilson. There's a book recommendation for the next Ask River question. You know, we have the company itself sort of sits in an ecosystem of things and systems and structures. And so, you know, Apple is now in a phase where the founder is no longer there. but it sits in the middle of the iPhone ecosystem and various other app store, the media business. Then you have, let's say, Google, where the founders are around, but they don't seem to be exercising too much control, but they still have a significant share of the voting rights. But the business, at least until last time I spent any time around it, was being run by one individual. You have Facebook. I mean, even in the management team, you see that there's slightly different structures and ecosystems and the ways in which the companies run. And I think that if I would have owned Costco, I would have wanted to pay a lot of attention to how is the culture being transferred from the initial founding team into being just the way that the place operates, as I feel I have a lot of understanding of how that works at Berkshire. You want to kind of see the company in all its complexity in a certain way and see it as embedded in a series of networks, a series of structures, a group. It's sort of like, what's its milieu, I guess. I don't know if that's helpful. Book recommendations. I read a review, or I saw something about this guy, Napoleon Hill, wrote Think and Grow Rich, which is a book that Prem Watsa used to give out, or maybe still does give out. He was saying that Napoleon Hill was a con man. It was kind of surprising. I stopped reading the article because his books have been so helpful to me. And I really appreciate everything that he told me. And I think that, Think and Grow Rich, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I know it's kind of tacky Americanism on some level, but they've just been really, really helpful to me. And I think that, I don't know if the markets will ever allow people to achieve what Warren Buffett achieved and what Charlie Munger achieved. But what we can all achieve is to be extraordinarily valuable to the communities that we're a part of. And that starts with the kinds of skills that are taught by people like Dale Carnegie and Napoleon Hill. So I think that, there's a famous story of Tony Robbins going to some guy, and Tony Robbins says, "I bought your book and nothing happened." Well, no, Tony Robbins says, you're not helping me. And the guy says, "Have you read my book?" And Tony Robbins says, "Yes." And the guy asks him, "How many times?" There's a few books, and I think that How to Win Friends and Influence People is one of them, where one can just keep reapplying those lessons to live a better life. So what company reminds me of Berkshire? I got the chance to visit Markel. Tom Gain is an awesome guy. He made an extraordinary hiring choice in hiring a guy from Google called Sarab Madan. Markel, the Markel style, reminds me an awful lot of Berkshire. I also think that Exor, that I visited in Turin not so long ago, reminds me very much of Berkshire Hathaway. And I think that John Elkann is a remarkable guy, somebody to watch. Financial modeling, I do less and less of it. It's not what's going to get you to the promised land. If you have to rely on a financial model, it's probably not cheap enough. Simple as that. Fernando. Gurjeev asks, what's the one takeaway that changed my life after meeting Mr. Buffett, which I'll always remember for the rest of my life? I mean, so many, but one is that he's definitely smarter than I am. I say that really sincerely, and I've said it elsewhere. If Warren says that you don't need the extra 40 or 50 IQ points, my words to Warren are, that's fine, I'll take them if you can possibly give them to me. But also the realization that being rich was really not that important to Warren. It's about doing what he loves to do, and it's the daily conditions of his life. And focus on getting that right, and don't worry so much about how much money you're making in the process. So there's my answer for now, Gurjeev. Thomas asks, the change in stance, he wants to understand why the change in stance, or he wants to understand the change in my stance on speaking to management, what sparked the change. I think that if I would have been in the famous, I invested in a company that ended up going bankrupt. And I think that if I would have been closer to the management, and I had many opportunities to be close to the management, I might have seen things. So that was an extraordinarily painful chapter in my life that, in retrospect, we have to go back and look at why things happened the way they did. And I think there were developments happening at the company that I could easily have been on top of. And I wasn't, because I wasn't speaking to the management, and I'd voluntarily thrown a tool. And I think the analogy that I've been used is that speaking to the management is a bit like a chainsaw. And in a chainsaw, if you use a chainsaw to cut down trees, you could also chop off your leg. And so it's a rather dangerous tool to be handled with care. So speaking to management, because management can seduce you into all sorts of stories. And so my reaction at the time that I wrote the book was, don't speak to management. And that would be like saying, I've got to cut down a forest of trees, but I'm not going to take a chainsaw with me. I'm going to use my penknife. Just because a chainsaw is dangerous and you might cut off your leg with it doesn't mean that you don't use it with the appropriate precautions to cut down trees. And so I realized, talking to management is certainly an important, very important source of information, and talking to former management and management at competitor companies and suppliers and all of those things. And it has to be used with care. So we have to sequence how we do the research, and we have to appropriately weight what we're hearing from different people depending on where they are, what axe they have to grind. And I think one of the key ways that I seek to inoculate myself from management who will engage in a sales pitch to me without me even realizing it is to read and learn as much as I can about the company from other sources before speaking to management. So speaking to management one of the things I do further down the road rather than up front. So it's a great question, Thomas. Thanks for asking it. Andrew asks, any thoughts on Buffett saying he thinks markets are fairly priced based on the low interest environment versus the Wilshire GDP at all-time highs and the Schiller P higher than ever it's ever been, 72,000? I mean, Andrew, where are interest rates? You want if interest rates are 0 or 1% or 2%, that could justify 50 times earnings multiple on stable earnings. Jason asks, curious if I could speak a little more about what I've learned about the cloud and the sort of competitive advantages that may or may not exist within the industry, companies within it. Data has gravity. The more data you have, the easier it is to acquire data. The more data of mine is stored in various different cloud services, the less I'm interested in pulling the data out. The cloud services always make it clear that the data is mine, but it's just a little more time, a little more difficult to pull the data out. So you end up wanting to leave it in. And so they're snowballs. They're enormous snowballs. Will Berkshire look different? Yeah. Yeah. Will it look different? Look, I believe that Berkshire will make fewer ballsy acquisitions once Warren and Charlie are not there than before, and they'll become more of a kind of company that is very good at managing its capital, very good at repurchasing stock, and very good at sort of like quietly, in a certain way, shrinking the capital base while raising the share price, which is effectively what I think, for example, Graham Holdings has done. Eventually sold the Washington Post, and still the shareholders have done extraordinarily well. So maybe not significantly different, just much higher share price, much smaller capital base of shares, much bigger repurchaser of its shares, something like that. So Sarah, I think that, this is a really important question. I appreciate you asking it, because I think it gets to the core of what I say to many of the people who are either investors with me or people who are thinking of investing, which is that the only way one gets rich, I believe, or I believe that I know this, but I'm going to say I believe because some people don't agree with me, is by owning the productive assets of society, holding non-productive assets, cash, cryptocurrencies, gold. All of those things just sit there. They don't do anything. And in an inflationary environment, that is not a great place to be. What is a great place? Well, you could say that the value of cryptocurrencies are going to go up or the gold's going to go up. But I think that the place, again, I like look at the Forbes 500. Where are those places? You don't see people who got rich on gold. You don't see people, maybe we'll see people who got rich on cryptocurrencies, but even then it won't be because they bought and held cryptocurrencies, because they started some Bitcoin mining operation. The Krocs, the Walmart family, the Buffett family, they all got rich by holding businesses for a long period of time. So I think that it's absolutely key to be exposed to real assets, absolutely key, in my humble opinion. Thank you for asking the question. Julian asks that he's noticed a trend towards macroeconomics-related discussions within the value investing community, especially during the current economic crisis. As a value investor, do I pay much attention to macro factors? I think that these crises, I remember that I got a subscription to Grant's Interest Rate Observer during the last crisis, because I said, I really need to know what's going on with central banks and what have you. So these crises tend to kind of get a trigger and a focus on macro figures. And then once the crisis is over, the focus on macro figures will go away. I don't pay much attention to the macro factors. And I studied plenty of economics, macro and micro. And I just think it's so hard to predict. I think that I feel happy and confident that the policymakers are taking the right choices. And I don't trust the newspapers to give me all the information. And having said that, look, you can't ignore them. They're coming at you from all sorts of different places. But the answer is no, I guess. I'm trying to make a long answer out of a short one. So Thomas Chua asks, how would I stress test a company given the shutdown may last for quite some time? We're living through something that nobody's ever lived through. Nobody's lived through something like this in our lifetime. We're at the limits. I mean, look, if an asteroid hit the Earth and we went into a nuclear winter for 5 years, probably we all have to start again, if to the extent that we survive. We're not quite there in this coronavirus, but if nobody leaves their homes for the next 5 years, nobody ever visits a shopping mall. How long can that go on for? And how long can governments keep funding the fact that people aren't working? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question, but I don't think it's going to come to that. Again, there's a certain amount of linear thinking there. So things tend not to go in a linear fashion, and we extrapolate as if they will, but they're not. Something will turn around. We just can't say exactly when. I mentioned don't risk much for small. Yeah, it was advice that was given, I think, by the CEO of Aflac Insurance to his son. Don't risk a lot for a little. I mean, I think the question or the statement explains itself. Put 2% of your portfolio into something that's going to go up 20 times. Don't put 50% of your portfolio into something that might go up 10%, but could also go to zero. Simple as that, I guess. It's been so much fun, everyone, going through this. It's fun to do. I guess this is my way of getting a fix of all the interactions I get in Omaha. I hope that this has served you in some way. It's been fun for me. We are a community. I mean, this was 100 people, but we're not, we're unusual. We're not the same as the rest of the population. There's a reason why we come to Berkshire. There's a reason why we make an effort to come into something like this Blue Dot group. I appreciate hanging out with you. I appreciate associating with you. And looking forward to seeing you next year at Berkshire. And let's all go and learn from what Warren and Greg Abel have to say. Thank you so much for being here.